My name is Lynn Calloway, and I was 41 years old the day I stood in my mother's kitchen, the kitchen where I had made her oatmeal every single morning for 7 years, and listened to my older sister Diane tell a room full of relatives that I was. And I want you to remember these exact words, just the housekeeper who happened to share our last name. I want you to sit with that for a second. Just the housekeeper. 7 years. 11 medications managed every day. 4 hospitalizations. 2 falls in the middle of the night, where I caught her before she hit the floor. Countless Sunday mornings where I held her hand and read to her from the Bible. She kept on her nightstand because her eyes had gotten too weak to read it herself. And in 30 seconds, in front of my aunts and uncles and cousins and neighbors who had known me since I was 7 years old, my sister reduced all of it to housekeeping. And here's the thing I need you to understand right now. At the very beginning of this story, Diane said those words on a Thursday. By the following Wednesday, a lawyer named Gerald Hutchins called me on my cell phone and asked me to come to his office alone. Not with my sisters, not with anyone, alone. And what he showed me when I walked through that door changed everything. Not just for me, for all of us, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the beginning because this story doesn't make sense unless you understand what our family looked like before that Thursday. And trust me, once you see the full picture, that moment in the kitchen is going to hit you very differently. I grew up in a pale yellow house on Sycamore Road in Dayton, Ohio. It was not a big house. 3 bedrooms, 1.5 bathrooms, a kitchen that always smelled like coffee and something baking, and a backyard with a rosebush that my mother planted the year she and my father moved in. She called it her Margaret Rose, after her own mother. That rosebush outlived my father, outlived 2 harsh winters that killed everything else in the yard. And it was still there, still blooming every June when my mother got sick. There were 3 of us girls. Diane was the oldest, 47 when this story ends. She lived in Columbus, about an hour and a half away, and she worked in real estate. Diane had always been the one who looked the part. Nice clothes, highlighted hair, a laugh that filled a room, and made everyone feel like they were in on a joke. Growing up, she was my mother's social daughter, the one my mother would talk about at church, the one whose accomplishments got mentioned first. Diane graduated from Ohio State. Diane got her real estate license. Diane married a man named Robert who wore a blazer to every family dinner. Then there was Patricia. We called her Patty. She was 44, and she lived in Phoenix, Arizona, which might as well have been another planet as far as family obligations went. Patty had reinvented herself completely after leaving Dayton. She did something in marketing, ran a blog for a while, took up hot yoga, and sent our mother a gift basket every Christmas with fancy soaps and flavored teas that my mother never used but always displayed on the bathroom shelf because Patty had sent them. Patty called on Sundays, sometimes when she remembered. And then there was me, Lynn, the youngest. I had stayed in Dayton. I worked as a bookkeeper for a small construction company, a job I had held for 14 years, a job that was steady and honest and paid my bills without any drama. I drove a 7-year-old Honda Civic. I rented a small apartment about 2 miles from my mother's house. I had never married, though I had come close once, a man named David, who eventually decided he wanted someone with, as he put it, more ambition. I was not flashy. I was not the daughter who got mentioned first at church, but I was the one who showed up. I need you to understand that I am not telling you this to make myself sound like a saint. I am really not. I stayed close to home, partly because I genuinely wanted to, and partly because leaving never felt like a real option for me, the way it did for Diane and Patty. I did not have a Columbus network or a Phoenix fresh start pulling at me. I had Dayton, I had my mother, and for a long time that felt like enough. My mother's name was Dorothy Calloway. Everyone called her Dot. She was a small woman, barely 5'2", with silver hair she kept neatly pinned and hands that were always either busy or folded in her lap. She had worked as a school librarian for 26 years, and she had the kind of quiet dignity that librarians seem to develop. A way of listening to you that made you feel like what you were saying mattered. She loved crossword puzzles, old movies, the rosebush in the backyard, and her 3 daughters, though I think she loved us in different ways and for different reasons. And I don't think she ever fully understood that those differences had consequences. My father passed away when I was 22. Heart attack, sudden, on a Tuesday morning. He was 58 years old. That loss hit our family hard in different ways. Diane handled it by throwing herself into work. Patty handled it by eventually leaving Ohio entirely. I handled it by spending more time at my mother's house, helping her figure out how to be alone after 30 years of not being alone. That habit of showing up, it started then, almost 20 years before the story I'm telling you now. It started with small things, driving her to the grocery store, helping her file her taxes, fixing the back door that my father had always meant to fix and never got around to. And then, about 7 years before my mother died, things got serious. It started with her knees. She had been having trouble for a couple of years, but in the spring when she was 71, she had a fall in the backyard near the rosebush and fractured her left hip. The surgery went well, the doctors said, but recovery was slow, and something about that fall changed her in ways that went beyond the physical. She became less steady on her feet and more uncertain in her mind. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, the way a river changes course. Little things first, forgetting words, losing track of what day it was, leaving the stove on. Diane came down from Columbus for the hip surgery. She stayed 4 days, brought flowers, charmed the nurses, cried at the right moments, and then went back to her life. Patty flew in from Phoenix for a long weekend, took about 300 photos of herself and my mother for what she called her Family Memories Project, cried also, and then flew back to her hot yoga and her marketing job. And I stayed. I want to be honest with you here, because I think honesty is what makes a story worth telling. In the beginning, I told myself it was temporary. I told myself that once Mom got back on her feet, I would have my life back, my evenings, my weekends, my small apartment that was just mine. I told myself my sisters would step up more once they saw how much was needed. I genuinely believed that for probably the first 2 years. By year 3, I had stopped believing it. Here's what those 7 years actually look like. Because I don't think people understand what long-term caregiving means. until someone walks them through the specifics. My mother was eventually diagnosed with moderate vascular dementia, which is a type of memory loss caused by reduced blood flow to the brain. She also had type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure, mild congestive heart failure, and chronic kidney disease. That meant 11 medications every single day, some of them twice a day, some of them with food, some of them without, some of them that could not be taken within 2 hours of each other. I kept a color-coded chart on the refrigerator. I refilled her pill organizer every Sunday evening. I called her pharmacy so many times over those years that the pharmacist, a man named Carl, knew my voice before I said my name. I moved into my mother's house in year 3. I kept my apartment for another 8 months because I think I was not ready to admit what was actually happening. And then I let it go and moved fully into the small bedroom at the end of the hall, the one that had been the sewing room, where my mother had kept her fabric and her patterns, and an old Singer sewing machine that she never threw away even after she stopped using it. I restructured my work life so I could do my bookkeeping job remotely, which my employer thankfully allowed. I drove my mother to every doctor's appointment, of which there were many. I cooked all her meals according to the dietary restrictions from her cardiologist and her nephrologist. I bathed her when she could no longer safely do it herself. I sat with her on the back porch every evening that the weather allowed, because the fresh air and the rosebush seemed to calm her in a way that nothing else quite did. On the nights when she woke up confused and frightened and called out for my father, I was the one who went to her room, sat on the edge of her bed, and held her hand until she remembered where she was. I did not resent her for any of it. I want to be clear about that. I resented other things, but not her, never her. Diane visited 4 times a year, sometimes 3. She always called ahead and planned her visits for good weekends when our mother was having a clear stretch and could hold a proper conversation. She brought wine and nice food, and she would spend Saturday afternoon going through old photo albums with Mom and laughing about memories. She was good at that. She was genuinely good at being present for the pleasant parts. On Sunday evening, she would hug our mother for a long time and cry a little in the driveway before she got in her car. And I truly believed, that those tears were real. What Diane was not good at was the other parts. She did not visit during the hospitalizations unless I specifically called her and said, "You need to come." She did not ask about the medications or the dietary restrictions or what the nephrologist had said at the last appointment. She did not offer to take a month or 2 weeks or even a single week so that I could have a break. She sent money occasionally, $200 here, $300 there, always with a note that said, "For Mom's expenses," and I put it toward groceries and copays, and I never said a word about the fact that I had not taken a real vacation in 4 years. Patty visited twice a year, usually. She was warmer than Diane in some ways, more openly emotional, more likely to say, "I love you," and mean it in the moment. But Patty also had a way of making her visits about her own feelings, her own grief about our mother's decline, her own exhaustion from the flight, her own discomfort with the medical equipment and the pill organizer and the reality of aging. She would cry and I would find myself comforting her, explaining to her what was happening with our mother's health, reassuring her that we were managing, all while also managing. She left feeling unburdened. I think she needed that. I also think she never once considered what I needed. There was a specific moment about 4 years in that I want to tell you about because it captures something important. It was a Sunday afternoon in November, and Patty was visiting. Our mother was having a harder day, a bit confused, repeating herself, occasionally calling Patty by the wrong name. Patty pulled me into the kitchen and said in a low, urgent voice, "Lynn, have you thought about a facility, a memory care place? It might be better for everyone." And I looked at her and I said, "Patty, she knows her house. She knows her rosebush. Every doctor she has says familiar surroundings are the best thing for her right now." And Patty said, and I remember this very clearly, "I just think you're making this harder than it needs to be. For yourself, I mean." She flew back to Phoenix the next morning. I went back to the pill organizer and the color-coded chart and the evening hours on the back porch. I want to tell you about something else, too. Something I noticed but didn't fully understand at the time. About 2 years before my mother died, she asked me to bring her a specific notebook from her bedroom closet. It was a small blue notebook, the kind with a hard cover that she had kept in a shoebox on the top shelf. I brought it to her, and she held it for a long time, just held it, running her thumb across the cover. Then she looked at me with one of her clear-eyed moments, the kind that became rarer and more precious as time went on, and she said, "Lynn, I write things down in here when I remember them. Important things. Will you keep this safe for me?" I said, "Of course." She handed it back to me and said, "Don't read it yet. You'll know when." I put it in my own nightstand drawer. I did not read it. I thought it was something sentimental, memories she was trying to preserve. I didn't think about it much after that. I should have, but I didn't. That notebook is a detail I need you to hold on to because it comes back. There was also an afternoon, maybe 18 months before she died, when a man came to the house. He arrived in a gray sedan, wore a modest suit, and introduced himself to me as Gerald Hutchins, an attorney. He said he had an appointment with my mother. I was surprised I hadn't known about any appointment, but my mother, who was having a good day, waved me off cheerfully and said, "Give us a little privacy, sweetheart. It's just some paperwork." I went into the backyard and pulled weeds from around the rosebush for 45 minutes. When Gerald Hutchins left, he nodded at me in the driveway in a way that I can only describe now, looking back as knowing. At the time, I thought it meant nothing. I thought my mother was perhaps updating her will or sorting some financial matter. I did not ask her about it directly because she had always been private about money, and I respected that. I am telling you these details now because I want you to see what I saw, which was nothing, and then I want you to see what was actually there, which was everything. My mother died on a Monday morning in March. She was 78 years old. She passed in her own bed, in her own room, in her own house on Sycamore Road, which was exactly what she had always said she wanted. I was with her. I had been with her through the night, sitting in the chair beside her bed, holding her hand. Her breathing had changed the evening before. And I knew the way you know when you've been paying close attention to someone for 7 years that we were close. The hospice nurse had come and gone and said to call her when it was time. My mother passed just before 8 in the morning, quietly, without distress, with the early March light coming through the window and the bare branches of the rosebush just visible in the backyard. I called Diane first, then Patty, then the hospice nurse, and then I sat in the kitchen and made myself a cup of coffee and cried for a long time by myself before anyone arrived. Diane and her husband, Robert, drove down from Columbus that same day. Patty booked a flight and arrived the next morning. And within approximately 36 hours of our mother's death, before the funeral arrangements were even fully made, I began to understand what kind of story I was actually in. It started with small things. Diane walking through the house with a particular look on her face that I can only describe as inventory. Opening closets, looking in drawers, not in a grieving way, but in an assessing way. Patty asking me, almost immediately, whether Mom had updated her will recently and whether I knew anything about her finances. I answered honestly, which was that I didn't know the details of her will, and that I had helped her manage her day-to-day expenses, but had no specific knowledge of her overall financial situation. On the second day, Diane sat me down at the kitchen table, the same table where our mother had eaten her oatmeal every morning, and said, with Robert sitting silently beside her like a supporting actor, "Lynn, we need to talk practically. The house is probably the main asset. It's worth somewhere around $280,000, maybe $300,000 in this market. The fairest thing is to sell it and split everything 3 ways." I said I thought we should wait until we spoke with whatever attorney Mom had worked with, that there was likely a will and we should follow what she wanted. Diane said, of course, in a tone that suggested she considered the conversation already settled, regardless of what any document might say. Patty spent most of that second day on her phone, which I understood because grief does strange things to people, and Patty had always coped by staying connected to her outside life. But there were moments when I caught her looking at the furniture, the antique side table in the living room, the china cabinet, the silverware, and there was a quality to that looking that made me uneasy. The funeral was on Thursday. My mother had a lot of friends, former colleagues from the library, neighbors, members of her church, and they all came. The service was at the church she had attended for 30 years, and her pastor spoke beautifully about her. I sat in the front pew between my sisters, and I held myself together through the service by focusing on the flowers and thinking about the morning she died, and how peaceful it had been, and how lucky we were that it had been peaceful. It was the gathering at the house afterward that broke me. There were maybe 40 people in that house, neighbors, relatives, church friends, a few of my mother's former library colleagues. Someone had set up food in the kitchen, and people were moving through the rooms the way people do at these gatherings, speaking in low voices, sharing memories, occasionally laughing at something fond. I was moving through it all in a daze, thanking people for coming, accepting condolences, when I found myself standing near the living room doorway and heard Diane's voice from inside. She was speaking to our Aunt Carol, my mother's younger sister. and to 2 or 3 other relatives I recognized. And she was talking about the house, about what it would sell for, about how the market in Dayton was actually quite good right now, about how she'd already spoken to a colleague in real estate who could list it. And then Aunt Carol, who I think was genuinely trying to say something kind, said something like, "Well, Lynn has certainly earned her share after everything she's done these past years." And Diane laughed, a short, bright laugh, and said, "Well, Lynn always did prefer to stay home. That was her choice. We can't all be homebodies." And someone else, I couldn't see who, said something I didn't catch, and then Diane said, louder than before, clearly aware that I was within earshot. She was basically just the housekeeper who happened to share our last name. We all have equal claim here. The room didn't go silent, not quite, because it was a busy room with 40 people in it. But the people nearest to that doorway heard it. I know they did, because I saw their faces change. Aunt Carol's face did something complicated. Robert, Diane's husband, looked at the floor, and I stood there in the doorway of my mother's house, the house where I had lived for 4 years, the house where I had held my mother's hand through 11 medications and 4 hospitalizations and 2 falls in the night and 1 last quiet morning in March, and I felt something happen inside me that I do not have a perfect word for. It wasn't rage. It was something colder and more complete than rage. It was a kind of settling. Like something that had been slightly off balance for years, just found its level. I did not say anything. I want you to notice that. I did not walk into that room and confront my sister. I did not cry. I did not make a scene at my mother's funeral gathering, which is what some part of me, the raw, exhausted part, wanted desperately to do. I went to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and I stayed. I finished the gathering with dignity. I thanked every single person who came. And when the last guest left, and it was just the 3 of us and Robert in the house, I told my sisters I was tired and I was going to bed. Diane said, "We should talk tomorrow about next steps." I said good night and I went to the sewing room, the small room at the end of the hall that had been my room for 4 years. And I sat on the edge of the bed and I thought about the blue notebook in my nightstand drawer. My mother's voice came back to me. "Don't read it yet. You'll know when." I opened the drawer. I took out the notebook, and I read it. I am going to tell you what was in that notebook in a moment, but first I need to tell you about the next morning, because the sequence matters. I came down to breakfast, and Diane was already at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen, which told me everything about how she had spent her morning mentally. Patty was on her 2nd cup of coffee. Robert had gone to get bagels. And Diane said, before I had even poured my coffee, "So I was thinking we meet with whoever Mom's lawyer was next week and get the process started." I said, "I'll reach out to Gerald Hutchins. He was the attorney she worked with." Diane looked up sharply and said, "How do you know who her attorney was?" I said Mom had mentioned him, which was true, just not the full picture. Diane made a note on her legal pad and said, "Good. The sooner we get this sorted, the sooner we can all move forward." She said move forward the way people say it when they mean move on from this inconvenient situation. I did not tell them what I had read in the blue notebook. I poured my coffee and I sat at the table and I was quiet, and my quietness, I think, they read as agreement or defeat. Patty said something gentle about how hard this all was, and how she hoped we could keep things amicable. I said I hoped so too. And I meant it, actually. I really did hope that. I called Gerald Hutchins that morning from the backyard, standing near the rosebush, which was still bare in early March, but had small, tight buds forming on its canes, the first signs of the spring that was coming. I told him that Dorothy Calloway had passed on Monday. There was a brief silence, and then he said, in a measured and not unkind voice, "I'm very sorry for your loss, Lynn. I've been expecting your call. Would you be able to come into my office on Wednesday? There are some matters we need to discuss." I said yes. He said, "Just you, please. I'll reach out to your sisters separately in due course." Just you. Those 2 words. I stood by the rosebush, and I felt the cold March air, and I thought about what I had read the night before in the blue notebook, and I thought about the way Gerald Hutchins had nodded at me in the driveway 18 months ago. That quiet, knowing nod, and for the first time since Monday morning, I felt something that was not grief or exhaustion or cold, hollow anger. I felt something that felt almost like my mother's hand on my shoulder. I did not tell Diane and Patty about the Wednesday appointment. I said I was going to run some errands, and I drove to Gerald Hutchins' office on Maple Street, which was a modest office above a dry cleaner, with a waiting room that had 2 chairs and a small table, with a plant on it that needed watering. His assistant, a young woman named Maria, offered me coffee, and I accepted, and then Gerald Hutchins came out and shook my hand and led me into his office and closed the door. He had a file on his desk. It was not thin. He sat across from me, and he folded his hands and he said, "Lynn, your mother came to me 2 years ago. She was having a good period at the time, cognitively, and she was very clear about what she wanted. She had me draw up a new will, but she also did something else that I'd like to explain to you carefully, because it has some significance." He opened the file, and he slid a document across the desk. It was a deed, a property deed for the house on Sycamore Road. And on that deed, as sole owner, was my name, Lynn Marie Calloway. He explained it to me in plain language, the way I'll explain it to you now. What my mother had done, with Gerald Hutchins' help, was execute what's called an enhanced life estate deed, sometimes called a ladybird deed, which is a legal instrument recognized in Ohio and several other states. What it meant in practical terms was this. My mother had transferred ownership of the house to me while retaining the right to live there for the rest of her life. The transfer had been completed 2 years ago, signed, notarized, and recorded at the Montgomery County Recorder's Office. The house was already mine, had been mine legally for 2 years. It did not go through probate. It was not subject to the will. It had simply, quietly already happened. There was also a will, a new one, drafted on the same day as the deed, which superseded the previous will my mother had made years earlier when my father died. In the new will, my mother had left her personal possessions, her savings account, which Gerald informed me had a balance of approximately $47,000, her jewelry, her furniture, and what he called all remaining personal effects, to be divided among her 3 daughters in a way she had specified. But the house, the primary asset, the $300,000 house, on Sycamore Road was already in my name and had been for 2 years. I sat in that chair and I looked at the deed with my name on it, and I did not cry, which surprised me because I had been crying easily all week. "I think I was too stunned to cry," I said. "Did she tell you why?" And Gerald Hutchins said, "She did. She wrote it in a letter that she asked me to give you today." He slid another envelope across the desk. My name was on the front in my mother's handwriting, the slightly shaky handwriting of her later years, and even seeing those letters, L-Y-N-N, in her hand made my throat tighten almost unbearably. He told me that beyond the deed and the will, there was something else I should know. My mother had asked him to keep a record. Over the 2 years between that first meeting and her death, she had periodically called Gerald Hutchins and dictated notes. Notes about her care, who was there, who was not, what had been done for her. She had done this on her own initiative, calmly and deliberately, during her clearer periods. Gerald had those notes in a file. He told me they were not legally necessary given the deed, which stood entirely on its own, but that my mother had wanted them to exist. "She said to me," Gerald told me, looking at his notes, "I want there to be a record, not because I want to punish my other daughters, but because I want the truth to exist somewhere. I want the truth to exist somewhere." My mother's words. In that moment, I saw her so clearly, sitting at this same desk 2 years earlier, small and silver-haired, and more precise than anyone had given her credit for, making sure the truth existed. I asked Gerald what happened next. He said he would contact my sisters and ask them to come to a formal reading of the will. He said this was standard procedure. The will reading would take place in his office the following Monday. He said I did not have to tell my sisters anything before then. He said I did not have to tell them at all, that it would all be made clear at the reading. He said, gently but directly, "Your mother anticipated that this might be a difficult moment for your family. She left instructions about how she wanted it handled." He tapped the file. "We'll follow her wishes." I drove home on Wednesday afternoon with the letter in my purse, unopened. I had decided to wait to read it until after Monday. I don't fully know why. I think I needed the sequence to play out. I think my mother would have understood that. The days between Wednesday and Monday were the strangest days of my life. I was living in the house on Sycamore Road with my sisters, the house that I now knew was legally mine, while they made plans around the kitchen table about selling it. Diane had pulled comps from the MLS. She had a number in mind. She spoke about timelines. Patty spoke about what she might do with her share. At one point, Diane suggested that since we'd all have to split the proceeds, perhaps I would want to use my portion to finally get a bigger apartment. "Something with a second bedroom, Lynn. You could have an office." I said that sounded interesting. I said it with a straight face. I am not proud of that exactly, but I am also not entirely not proud of it. On Sunday evening, the night before the reading, Patty came and found me in the backyard, standing by the rosebush. We stood there together for a few minutes without talking, then had probably been running ever since. I said, "I know you know Patty." And she nodded, and we stood there a little longer in the cold evening air, and that was all either of us said about it. Monday morning, Gerald Hutchins' office. All 3 of us, plus Robert, who Diane had insisted on bringing. Maria offered coffee. Gerald came out and shook everyone's hands. We filed into his office, which had been rearranged slightly with an extra chair. Gerald sat behind his desk with the file in front of him, and he looked at each of us in turn and he said, "Thank you all for coming. Before we begin with the will, there are some preliminary matters I need to address." He took out the property deed first. He placed it on the desk and he explained what it was, calmly and clearly, the same way he had explained it to me the previous Wednesday, using plain language, no jargon, the kind of explanation that leaves no room for misunderstanding. The house on Sycamore Road had been transferred to Lynn Calloway by enhanced life estate deed, executed and recorded 2 years ago. The transfer was complete and irrevocable. The house was not part of the estate and was not subject to the terms of the will. The room went silent. I mean that in a way that I think anyone who has been in a room when a truly unexpected truth lands will understand. It was not a dramatic silence. It was the silence of 4 people, processing information that did not fit the story they had been living in for the past 7 days. Robert made a sound that was not quite a word. Patty's coffee cup stopped halfway to her mouth and stayed there. Diane was the first to speak. She said, "That's not possible." Not loudly, almost quietly, which I found more striking than if she had shouted. Gerald said in the same measured tone, "I understand this may be surprising. The deed was properly executed and recorded. I can provide you with the recording information from the Montgomery County Recorder's Office if you'd like to verify it independently." He said this so neutrally that it was almost kind, the offer to verify, as if he understood that sometimes people need a moment to choose whether they want to fight something or accept it. Diane said she had dementia, she wasn't competent. And here is where Gerald Hutchins showed exactly why my mother had chosen him specifically. He opened the file and he said that concern was anticipated. The deed was executed at a point when Dorothy had been evaluated by her physician and cleared as having sufficient cognitive capacity to execute legal documents. I have that evaluation on file. Additionally, your mother's attending physician at the time provided a written statement to the same effect, which I also have here. He laid both documents on the desk side by side. I'd also note that the deed was executed 2 years before her death, when her cognition was considerably less impaired than in her final months. Diane looked at the documents and something happened to her face that I watched very carefully. The real estate professional expression, the composed, let's talk practically expression, slipped for just a moment, and underneath it I saw something that surprised me. She looked, for just that moment, like a daughter who had lost her mother and was only now beginning to understand it. It passed quickly. The composure came back, but I saw it, and I want to be honest with you about that, because my sister was not only a villain in this story. She was also a woman who had loved her mother in the ways she knew how, and had never fully reckoned with the ways she hadn't. That moment was real. I believe that now, even if I didn't fully believe it then. Gerald proceeded to read the will. The savings account, $47,000, was to be divided equally among the 3 daughters. The furniture and personal belongings were allocated thoughtfully, specific pieces to specific people, the china cabinet to Diane because she'd always admired it, a specific set of earrings to Patty, various items to me and to other relatives. The antique sewing machine was left to me specifically with a note in the will that said, and Gerald read this aloud, "Lynn kept it polished and in good repair for the years she lived with me. She always treated my things as carefully as if they were her own." Then Gerald picked up the last document in the file, and he said, "Dorothy also left a letter. She asked that I read it aloud to all three of you together." Patty made a sound then, a small sound. She had put down her coffee cup. Gerald cleared his throat and he read, "My darlings, if you're hearing this, it means I'm gone, and Gerald is doing exactly what I asked him to do. I want to start by saying that I love all three of my daughters completely and without condition. That is not something I say as a preamble to taking it back. It is simply true. Diane, you are brilliant and bold, and you have your father's laugh. Patty, you are warm and searching, and you feel things more deeply than you let anyone see. And Lynn, you are the one who stayed, not because you had to, because you are who you are." I made the decision about the house 2 years ago after a great deal of thought. I want you to know, Diane and Patty, that I made it not out of anger and not to punish you. I made it because I tried for a long time to believe that love shows itself in equal measure, no matter what form it takes. And I have come to believe instead that love shows itself through presence. Lynn was present. For 7 years she was present in the way that cost something, in the way that meant giving up things a woman her age should have had. I watched that, I noticed it, I wrote it down, because I wanted the truth to exist somewhere. The house is Lynn's because the house became Lynn's life. I hope you will not be angry with her. She didn't know. I made sure she didn't know. If you are angry, be angry with me. And I want you to sit with that anger for a little while, and then I want you to let it go. Because I am your mother, and I am asking you to. I have earned that ask, I think, in 30 years of loving you. There is one more thing I want to say, and I want to say it to all three of you together. The rosebush in the backyard, I planted it the year your father and I moved into that house. I have watched it survive things that should have killed it. Hard winters, dry summers. A drought the year Patty was born that took everything else in that yard. It always came back. I used to think that was just the nature of roses, that they are tougher than they look. But I think now it is also because someone always tended it. Your father for the first years, and then Lynn for the last ones. Things survive when someone tends them. People survive the same way. Tend each other. That is all I ask. All my love, every last bit of it. Mom Gerald Hutchins. Folded the letter and placed it on the desk, and the room was completely quiet, the kind of quiet that has weight to it. I looked at the desk. I looked at my hands. I did not look at my sisters because I did not trust what I would see or what I would feel if I saw it. It was Patty who broke first, not loudly, not dramatically, just a long shaking exhale, and then she was crying, really crying. The kind of crying that has been held in for days and maybe years. She pressed her hand over her mouth, and she looked at the ceiling and she cried. Diane sat very still for a long time. Robert put his hand over hers on the arm of the chair. She did not pull away from it. She stared at the desk, at the letter Gerald had folded, and I watched her go through something internal that she would never fully show any of us, that was simply hers to go through. Then she looked at me, and she said, and her voice was different from any voice I had heard from her all week, stripped of the real estate composure, stripped of the inventory look, just her voice. "Lynn, I'm sorry for what I said at the house after the funeral." She stopped, started again. "I was wrong to say it. I knew it was wrong when I said it." She stopped again. Diane has never been good at apology. I don't think anyone taught her how. She got there anyway. I looked at my sister, 47 years old, highlighted hair slightly less perfect than usual, sitting in a lawyer's office above a dry cleaner on a Monday morning in March, trying to find the words that do not come easily to people who have spent their lives being composed. And I thought about my mother's letter, "Tend each other." I said, "I know, Diane." And that was enough. Not everything. Not a resolution of every complicated thing between us, because some of those things go back 20 years and will take much longer than a Monday morning to sort out. But enough for that room on that day. Gerald gave us a few minutes. He stepped out with Maria and closed the door quietly behind him, the way a person does when they understand that a room needs to be private for a little while. Patty was still crying. I reached over and put my hand on her arm, and she grabbed it with both of hers and held on. Diane looked out the window at Maple Street and breathed steadily and deliberately, the way people do when they are choosing not to fall apart. Robert sat quietly, and for once I was glad he was there because Diane needed something solid to be next to. After a while, Gerald came back in. He finished the procedural matters efficiently and kindly. He answered Diane's questions, and she had several, careful and specific. Because whatever else Diane was, she was not stupid, and she needed to understand the full picture. He answered each one the same way he had answered everything, plainly and without condescension. By the end, Diane's questions were not challenges anymore. They were just questions. That was something. We left the office and stood on Maple Street in the thin March sunshine, and nobody said anything for a moment. Then Patty said she needed to change her flight, that she had booked to leave tomorrow, but she wanted to stay a few more days. She looked at me when she said it, a question in it, and I said, "Of course, stay as long as you want." Diane said that she and Robert would stay through the weekend if that was all right. I said yes. We drove back to the house on Sycamore Road, my house. I had not fully let myself feel that yet, and I still couldn't quite, standing in the driveway, looking at the pale yellow paint and the front porch where my mother had sat every morning with her coffee before her knees got bad. It did not feel like winning something. I want to be clear about that, because I know how this kind of story can be told. As a triumph, as a comeuppance, as a satisfying reversal, where the right person gets the prize and the wrong people get what they deserve. And there is some of that here. I won't pretend there isn't. My mother saw clearly, and she acted on what she saw, and I am grateful for it in ways I cannot fully put into words. But what I felt standing in that driveway was mostly just loss. The house was mine, and my mother was gone, and those two things existed together in a way that made the first one feel very different from what I might have imagined. I would have given the house back in a second to have her sitting on that porch with her coffee. I think any of us who have loved someone and lost them know that specific math. What you'd trade, what you wouldn't. I went inside and I put the kettle on, because that is what my mother always did when something hard had happened, and I have inherited that from her. The belief that hot tea does not fix anything but creates the right conditions for sitting with things that cannot be fixed. Patty came and sat at the kitchen table. After a moment, Diane came and sat across from her. Robert made a diplomatic exit to the living room, which I appreciated. I made 4 cups of tea and brought them to the table, and I sat down with my sisters, and we drank tea in our mother's kitchen, my kitchen, and we did not talk about the house or the deed or the will or any of it. Patty talked about our mother, a specific memory she had from when she was about 12. A summer day when Mom had taken all 3 of us to the public pool and had bought us each an ice cream on the way home and had been uncharacteristically silly about it, doing an impression of someone she worked with that had made all 3 of us fall over laughing. I had completely forgotten that afternoon until Patty described it, and then it came back fully, the chlorine smell and the ice cream and Mom laughing at her own impression. Diane said she remembered it too. She said Mom had been wearing a yellow dress that day. We all confirmed the yellow dress independently, and then we all laughed a little, the recognizing laugh, the laugh that belongs specifically to people who share a childhood. That laugh, that was real too. I need you to know that as much as everything else. The hard parts were real, and the complicated parts were real, and the unkind things that were said were real. And that laugh was also real. We were sisters before any of this happened, and we were sisters in that kitchen drinking tea, and we will be sisters after, which means we will be working out the complicated parts for years, and probably for the rest of our lives. I think that is true, and I think it is okay. I think my mother knew it too. Tend each other. She didn't say it would be easy, she just said to do it. Patty stayed for 5 days. Diane and Robert stayed through the weekend. In those days, we went through my mother's things together, carefully, following the instructions she'd left in the will about who got what, but also just being together in it, the way families have to be when they are moving through the physical evidence of a life. There were moments of unexpected sweetness, finding things none of us remembered, a photo of our parents from before any of us were born, where they were both laughing at something off camera, a small journal my mother had kept in her 30s that we agreed without discussion none of us would read. There were also moments of tension, old patterns resurfacing, old dynamics asserting themselves, because families don't transform completely in a week. But the tension was different now. It had less certainty in it, less assumption. We were all, I think, slightly more careful with each other than we had been before. I'll take slightly more careful. That is not nothing. The last evening before Diane and Robert left, Diane found me in the backyard by the rosebush. It was late afternoon, and the light was going golden the way it does in Ohio, in March when you get a clear day, which is not often. The rosebush had more buds on it now than it had the week before. Another week, and it would start to open. Diane stood next to me and looked at the rosebush, and she said, "Mom really loved this thing." I said, "Yes, she did." Diane said, "Do you know how to take care of it?" And I said I'd been watching Mom take care of it for years, and I thought I had the general idea. Diane nodded slowly. Then she said, "If you ever want company, weekends I mean, Robert and I, you don't have to be alone in this house." And the way she said it, it was not about the house. It was not about any of what had happened in that lawyer's office. It was just my sister telling me she wanted to show up. Maybe for the first time, understanding what showing up actually meant. I said that would be nice, and I meant it. That night, after everyone was asleep, I went and got the blue notebook from my nightstand drawer, and I sat at the kitchen table with the last of the tea, and I read through it properly, all of it, for the first time. My mother had started it about 3 years before she died. The early entries were clearer, longer sentences, more detail. As the notebook went on, the handwriting got shakier and the entries shorter, but she had kept going, kept writing things down during her clear moments, right up until about 8 months before her death, which was around the time she couldn't reliably hold a pen anymore. The entries were exactly what Gerald Hutchins had described. Records. Who was there? What had happened? Small specific details. The kind of details that only someone paying close attention would notice. Lynn drove me to the cardiologist today. Traffic was bad, and she didn't complain. Lynn sat up with me last night when I was frightened. She didn't make me feel ashamed for being frightened. Lynn fixed the back step, the one Harold always meant to fix. She didn't say anything about it, just fixed it. She had written about my sisters, too, in her careful and unsentimental way. Diane visited this weekend. She brought beautiful flowers. She doesn't know what medications I take. I don't think she's ever asked. She is my daughter, and I love her. And she is also very far away from me, even when she is standing in the same room. Patty called. She sounded busy. I told her I was fine. I am not fine, but I knew she needed me to be fine, so I was. And then, toward the middle of the notebook, one entry that stopped me completely. I read it 3 times. I think Lynn believes that no one notices. I think she has lived so long in the invisible work of this that she has forgotten it is possible to be seen. I see her. I have always seen her. I am writing it down so that somewhere, in something that will outlast me, it is recorded. I see my daughter Lynn. I see what she does, and I see who she is. And I am so proud of her that sometimes when she doesn't know I'm watching, I have to look away because the feeling is too big for my face. I sat at my mother's kitchen table and I read those words and I let myself cry the way I had not quite let myself cry since Monday morning, the real kind, the kind that takes a while and uses you up and leaves you feeling scraped clean afterward. I cried for my mother, and I cried for the 7 years, and I cried for every night in the chair by her bed, and every Sunday evening with the pill organizer, and every moment I had wondered whether any of it was seen or known, or held by anyone other than me. She had seen it. She had written it down. The truth existed somewhere. When I was done, I washed my face at the kitchen sink, and I looked out the window at the dark backyard, and I could just make out the shape of the rosebush in the light from the kitchen window, its bare canes and its tight small buds, and its absolute intention to bloom again. I thought about my mother planting it the year she moved into this house, younger than I am now. My father still alive. All 3 of her daughters not yet born. She had put something living in the ground, and tended it for decades, and it had outlasted the drought and the hard winters, and eventually her own ability to tend it herself. And then someone else had taken over the tending, and it had kept going. Things survive when someone tends them. I turned off the kitchen light. I went to bed. Tomorrow I would call the pharmacist, whose name was Carl, who knew my voice before I said my name, and tell him that Dorothy Calloway had passed and that her prescriptions could be closed out. I would call the hospice service to return the equipment. I would call the utilities and begin the long administrative process of transferring things into my name, the name that was already on the deed but not yet on the electric bill. I would begin, carefully and without rushing, the work of making this house mine in the everyday sense, not just the legal one. It would take time. That was all right. I was good at the long work. My mother had seen to it that I knew how to do the long work. And in a few weeks, when the Ohio weather finally decided to cooperate, I would go out to the backyard with gloves and pruning shears, and I would tend the rosebush the way I had watched my mother tend it for years. I knew how. I had been paying attention. It would bloom in June. It always did. I know how these stories are supposed to end, with the wrongdoer humbled and the righteous triumphant, and everything resolved into clean, satisfying lines. I want to be honest with you that this one does not end exactly like that, because real things don't. What I have is a house and a letter and a blue notebook full of my mother's handwriting and two sisters who are complicated people, as I am a complicated person, and a family that is going to take years of careful tending to become what it could be. But I also have this. I have the knowledge that my mother saw me, that in her careful, deliberate way, she made sure the truth existed, not to punish anyone, not to win anything, but because she believed that the truth deserved to exist, that the invisible work deserved to be made visible. That presence is a form of love, and that love, when someone is paying attention, does not go unrecorded. My name is Lynn Calloway, and I am 41 years old, and I live in a pale yellow house on Sycamore Road in Dayton, Ohio. My mother left it to me, and every June, without fail, the rosebush blooms. The end.